Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's weekly live stream, where we cover not just the hot public policy issues of the day, but those issues that are affecting your lives. So wherever you're joining us from, whether it's from the great state of Texas or one of the many other great states in this country, thank you for taking time to join. This week, we're covering an unfortunate piece of legislation, in fact, something that is now law, and that is the American Rescue Recovery Plan. And our guests today are experts at what this plan does. And I'm sorry to say there's not a lot of rescue in it, not much COVID relief in it at all, but it is law. And so we need to diagnose what it's going to do, both good and bad. I'll give you a headline, most of it's going to be bad, but we do have the question at the state level of what states are going to do with the funds. And so if you're like me and you want to be an optimist in spite of the challenges that we're facing in the policy world, stay tuned in because these three guests are going to give us the way forward. You do know, however, that one of the things we do at this foundation and certainly at the places of employment of two of our guests is tell the truth. And much of the truth that we have to tell today is challenging because the government is spending more money of our money that we don't have, going into further debt for very little return on investment. We're still, a lot of what is in this piece of legislation, this so-called COVID Relief Act, is actually going to undermine our system of federalism. If you've been tuning into this live stream as we now have surpassed our 1 year mark, you know that we always tell the truth with smiles on our faces and try to give you solutions that you as audience members can participate in. And I think you're going to hear those today. Having said that, the situation from a fiscal point of view is dire, and we would be remiss if we simply didn't say so candidly. If we haven't met, I'm Kevin Roberts, the executive director of this foundation and privileged to serve as host of this live stream. That's a long-winded way of saying that my job here is simply to let the experts do the talking, and so I've got some questions for them. Let me introduce them. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Vance Ginn, a wonderful Ph.D. economist who recently served in the Office of Management and Budget. Vance, who is just down the hall here from me in our TPPF studio, is our chief economist here at the foundation. We're also joined by our friends in Washington, D.C., Rachel Greszler, who's a research fellow in economics, budget, and entitlements at the Heritage Foundation, and also Jared Walczak, Vice President of State Projects at the Tax Foundation. If you are interested in public policy generally, and in particular interested in fiscal policy, and if you haven't been following what Rachel and Jared and Vance say and write, you're really missing out. Not only do they take very difficult concepts and put them into understandable language for lay people like me, they also do so in a very cheerful way. So I think you're going to enjoy our conversation today. Vance, I'm going to turn to you first for the proverbial high-level question. And that question is, what's going on with the American economy today? We're going to get into the legislation here in a minute, but give us the Ginn economic brief, as we like to say here each month.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be with you and our audience. And, we've got a lot going on in the overall economy. It's been an interesting year as we've really come across the year since all the lockdowns and shutdowns and things like that, when the pandemic really got going with COVID-19 and everything else. And so today, fast forward a year ahead, and what we see is an unemployment rate of 6.2%, which is much higher than what we had just a year ago at 3.5%. We have many people who are still unemployed, even though there has been a number of jobs that have come back online when you look at the private sector. But even in the private sector, there's still about 8 million fewer people employed than there were just last February. So we still got a lot of work to do. There's still a high number of jobless claims each month. You know, the economy itself has come back. In the third quarter, we saw record-breaking annualized economic growth. Fourth quarter was also accelerating at a pretty rapid pace. The first quarter hopefully will be the same as we end that this month. And so what I think what we've seen is that the labor market continues to have many struggles as families, those in Texas and elsewhere, continue to know people who are unemployed, who maybe have lost their business, as we've seen tens of thousands of businesses close during this period of time. And so there is a lot of struggles that's going on. And the problem is I'm concerned that things like the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 which is about $2 trillion on top of the $4 trillion that's already been authorized by Congress, is not going to put us in the right direction. And in fact, will keep people more onto the sidelines and not looking for a job, and slowing our economy down overall, as we have burdening debt that you correctly mentioned of about $28 trillion. So we've got a lot to talk about today, but I think, look, we're coming back some, but we've still got a ways to go.
Very good. So Vance, we'll come back to you in just a moment about the American Rescue Plan Act. But I want to pivot to our guests, Rachel and Jared now. And Rachel, I'll turn to you first and asking you just to write some headlines for us regarding this piece of legislation. We'll get into a lot of the details momentarily, but what are the 2 or 3 big summaries that you would write for our audience about this piece of legislation?
I think first would be the timing and the size of this package. It may have made sense a year ago to pass a package of this size when we had almost a complete shutdown for many sectors of the economy and we needed to get money out the door quickly. But today we're facing, an expedited pace of getting the vaccines out there, more and more places opening up. Today, my kids went to school for the first time in a year. And so this doesn't make sense to be throwing an additional $1.9 trillion out there now. We've now spent $47,000 for every household in America on the COVID crisis. And yet the money that's part of this recent package, $1.9 trillion, only 9% of that is directed at the COVID-19 pandemic itself and at the medical, interventions necessary there. The rest of it is just a bunch of liberal wish list items that aren't going to help the recovery, but that are instead going to hurt it. There's things like a pension bailout in there. There's added unemployment insurance benefits all the way through September, when we've heard from businesses that are trying to get going again, that's actually an impediment to them to get their workers to come back.
Yeah, there is a lot there, Rachel. We'll dig into some of that. It's not an overstatement to say that this bill is so large. I would even use the adjective monstrous, that we could probably take 8 hours just to slice and dice it. But we'll do a little bit of slicing and dicing to give our audience members a sense of some of the talking points they might use if they want to call state legislators or state officials, or for that matter, their members of Congress if they want to complain. It's already law, so we can't change it, at least for now. Jared, I'm just going to turn to you with the same question and ask you to highlight other aspects of the bill that are troubling to you, maybe stand out, I presume in a challenging way, but perhaps there's something good about it.
Yeah, let me focus on some of the provisions that affect states, because I think that's important to a lot of people on this call. And it's more what I do too, is I'm on the tax side. So obviously there's $350 billion in state and local aid in this bill. And in some ways, this seems like a holdover from a much earlier time. If you go back to a year ago today, you have states in panic crisis mode because they expect a stock market collapse. They expect all kinds of things that are going to put their fiscal situation in absolute crisis. And the reality is that most of that simply hasn't happened. About half of the states ended the calendar year with increased revenues, not by a lot, not necessarily by what their targets were, but increased revenues. Even the ones that remained didn't lose much. In fact, in aggregate, revenue losses for states were only $2 billion. And this is $200 billion almost for states, plus additional amounts for localities and territories. So there's this huge question, why? What are you going to do with all of it? And there's restrictions on how you can use it, which are really relevant. We can come back to those at some point if that's relevant in this conversation, but you have a handful of things you can use this money for. I think states are going to struggle to figure out what in the world they're doing this for, and you could have some, I think, bad creativity because they can't spend it on ordinary operating expenses in most cases, so they might create a lot of things that fit the bill, that qualify, but really aren't top priorities. And then there's this corresponding restriction in the bill. You cannot use the funding to provide a net tax cut. You can't offset that directly or indirectly. On the direct side, I'm fine with that. This aid is for a few purposes. One of them is not providing a tax cut. Plus, since it's a one-time grant, that would be a one-time tax cut, not great policy. The direct provision doesn't bother me. The indirect provision, though, is really poorly defined. Presumably, it's to put a guardrail on so you can't play shell games and provide a tax cut by just shifting things around. But there's significant concerns that the way this is written could really tie states' hands in certain circumstances, not in all cases, but could tie their hands so that they can't have the full scope of fiscal policy that you would expect over the course of potentially 3 years.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that direct and indirect, especially the indirect prohibition on using this money for tax relief at the state level. Before we do that, though, because I want to aid our audience members and giving them some tools that they can use with their state legislatures, I want to turn to you, Vance, and I want to take a step back just to make sure that we're not getting too caught up in details too early. And also want to ask you this question because you were in the Trump administration helping to frame at least the early response to COVID relief. You take a step back and you think about the last year of the Trump administration, the first few months of the Biden administration, what Congress did over that span of time. How would you grade the government, the federal government's response to COVID? In other words, on the fiscal policy side, has Congress been doing the kinds of things that you think make sense? Could it be doing other things better? Should it not be doing certain things that it has done?
Yeah, Kevin, I mean, it's a great question. Something I've pondered quite a bit over the last year as going in the Trump administration of June 2019, leaving in May of 2020. There was no idea, right, that this COVID-19 pandemic was going to happen. We had a record-breaking economy. Things were really hitting on all cylinders. You had job growth that was hitting record paces. You also had unemployment rates were the lowest for many demographic groups. Just a lot of things going really well at the time. And then this thing called COVID-19, the novel coronavirus, started over in China and started to spread across the globe, come here into the United States. And it was something that me and my team, as a group of economists, were really looking at and figuring out what's going on here and how can we best give information to the task force of Fauci and Birx and others along the way. And it was something that was really unprecedented. It's been the word that's been used. And we were really trying to figure out what should we do next. And that's when the discussion really got started about a COVID relief bill, which there were a couple early ones on about families first and some other things that were going on at the time before the CARES Act really got started. And the discussion there of, checks being sent out to families, of the PPP to businesses along the way, and other sort of programs that were in there. I mean, think about the PPP at the time, about $350 billion to the SBA, the Small Business Administration, which usually only has maybe $1 billion that they're allocating, not $350 billion. So it's something that was very large sort of relief response of about $2.2 trillion to figure out what to do during that unprecedented event, where states were trying to figure out what exactly they were going to do. And many of them started to lock down along the way. And then we've seen subsequent bills also being passed, where we've had about $4 trillion that has now been authorized by Congress in some capacity to go out either in these checks to higher unemployment benefits per week. At one point, it was at $600, which is more than what most people make in their median salary that's out there. You also have the PPP money that was going to businesses. I mean, there was just a lot of money that was being thrown around the system, much less what the Federal Reserve was doing with printing money along the way and trying to put money into the system. What's interesting about all that is that we still have about $1 trillion that hasn't been allocated, even though it's been authorized by Congress. So I think going back, there's a lot of this money that we need to look at and learn lessons from that we should have been a little bit more targeted, temporary, and timely with our overall response. And in my view, we should have been opening up much more quickly by states to allow for the economic vibrancy of people and to be innovative along the way to best deal with the COVID-19 situation and the livelihoods, because otherwise many of those would have been lost, that have been lost during this period of time. So whenever you think about what was going on in the Trump administration was very different from when the Biden administration comes in, when things are improving, not only from an economic standpoint, but also with the COVID-19 situation, with the number of vaccines that are going out and the number of cases have been on the downturn, which is a good sign here, where more states, hopefully like Texas, which we just opened last week, can continue to open up so you can have more job creation being made. And so what I'm seeing now is that we're throwing $2 trillion more to a problem where we really don't have the problems that we once did. When more people are now being employed, and unemployment rate has been going down. Many people are still struggling, but the way that they're able to have the dignity and the self-sufficiency to hold them over for the long term is by opening up more of these economies, to have a job instead of more of a handout. And so I think that's really the dichotomy that we're facing now, is that there was at one point in the Trump administration, how do we make sure that this disaster doesn't become a catastrophe? Now it's like, okay, what exactly are you doing? Well, you're you're putting forward a progressive wish list to expand government through different safety nets relative to just actually dealing with the issues of COVID-19 through vaccines, distribution, things of that nature that helps us to open up more quickly. And so that is where I think we really see the difference between the two.
No, thanks for that response, Vance. It's very thorough. And I want to pivot from a point that you made, or because of a point that you made, which is that this bill could have been dramatically better. And Rachel, I want to turn to you on how it could be better in terms of the federal government itself. And then Jared, I'm going to come to you on improvement for states if this bill were different. But Rachel, the question for you is kind of the proverbial magic wand question. I'm going to hand you a magic wand and you're going to rewrite this bill. And how would it look differently, both in terms of the overall price tag for the taxpayer, but number two, specific policies that didn't have a lot of emphasis in the bill or perhaps weren't even in there? And what would you take out? I just want our audience members to get a sense of kind of the scope of the problem.
Yeah, well, I think Vance laid it out pretty well. And when you have these government programs that necessarily have to be one size fits all at the federal level, you try to target all these different areas that are in need. And what you end up with is a complicated maze, and businesses and individuals are struggling to figure out what's available for them to help, and is taking one program going to impact something else. And so the reality is I think that most business owners and most Americans just want to get back to living their lives and running their businesses, and they want the freedom to do that. And if you look at what has happened across the states, the 10 states with the fewest restrictions in place have 4.7% unemployment rate. The 10 states with the most, 7.1%. That's a big gap there. And so I think that if I were to rewrite this law, I would drastically shrink it down in size and focus only on the COVID-19 health pandemic itself, and then let the state and local governments be the ones to provide the targeted need that they're better able to do, because they are on that local level and they're able to help the businesses and the individuals based on the restrictions that they're putting in place. You know, one of the things in this bill is that it's throwing money at the states and it's rewarding them for keeping excessive lockdowns on their people. When you look at California, 9% unemployment rate, it's going to get $6,700 more per person than Georgia, that has a 5.1% unemployment rate. And that's not something that's fair, and that's not what we want to encourage, and it's not what business owners and Americans want. So I would take all the pork, I would take all the things out of the bill that are continuing to encourage people to be unemployed instead of giving them an opportunity to have a job, and then take out the checks to Americans and the increase in the welfare state that's not at all tied to the level of work. You know, the reality is it might have made sense to get the money out the door to everybody at the beginning, when the unemployment systems weren't set up and couldn't get it to them. But we've seen that most Americans are actually saving that money, and they're paying down their credit cards in record levels, 20% savings rate during part of last year. You know, sending them more money is not going to stimulate the economy. And it's great for people to pay down debts and to save, but not when that comes at the expense of increasing the federal debt.
Yeah, that's well said. In fact, I was telling a neighbor who was asking me over the weekend, although with some sarcasm, isn't it great that I get to get this stimulus check and pay down my credit card debt? And I said, and he understood, yes, it is good, because you will soon have much higher taxes and you will need some income to use your income to pay for those. So Jared, I want to come to you on an additional state question, and Rachel queued you up well. Magic wand, I'm going to hand you the magic wand. How would you have changed this bill to make it more effective for addressing the real needs of states?
Yeah, there are some genuine needs that states have right now. This addresses very few of them with this very large grant of $350 billion, because that goes into 4 buckets. You can spend it on things like under the CARES Act, where you can do public health and public safety responses, responding both the economic and the public health elements of this. States had trouble spending that $150 billion. They didn't finish spending it, so there's not a lot more necessarily to spend there. You can do pay enhancements for certain essential workers in the private sector. You can do some very limited things on like water, sewer, and broadband. And I'm sure some states will do rural broadband. And you can cover actual revenue losses, which, as I mentioned earlier, is not that significant. There aren't that many revenue losses, and where they are, they're mostly small. So then, like, what do you do with the rest? But there's $350 billion. Where states have a genuine need, their hands are potentially tied. Unemployment compensation trust funds are in crisis in much of the country. Many states have taken out what are called Title 12 advances, which are federal loans that you have to repay with interest. And the longer you take to repay them, the more your in-state businesses end up paying to the federal government in taxes. There's essentially a penalty through taxes for your state being insolvent. So these things are in crisis, and the states themselves will tax you so much more as a business on your hiring because of this. Maryland recently took executive action to prevent a 600% increase in taxes that would have been automatically conditioned on the fact that their trust fund is insolvent for a business that had a lot of layoffs, because that was a business with no layoffs. With one with a lot of layoffs, we could be talking a 4,400% tax increase. This becomes just impossible to rehire. So states need to replenish these funds. And the most obvious way the federal government could have helped them is to just have some sort of direct grant of a direct number of dollars into the fund for every week of payment you made. Instead of doing that, so 100 billion, for instance, could have covered about $221 per week of unemployment that states paid, and that would cover most of the $144 billion states paid in regular compensation during the previous year. Normally it's 30 billion. It was 144 billion last year. It's huge. It's significant. That is a real state need. On the other hand, states don't seem to have a good way to spend this $350 billion. If I were recreating this bill, I'd strike all 350, but I'd provide somewhere around 100 billion to cover unemployment compensation trust fund losses, because that's where the need exists.
Yeah, I tell you, there is so much to be worried about. Vance, I'm going to turn to you, and then I'll ask all of you one more question before we get to audience questions. If you're in the audience and you'd like to ask a question, just type it into the comments box of whatever social media channel you're using. But Vance, the question for you is Texas specific. A plurality of our audience on Mondays is here in Texas. And so for those of you in Texas, this will be relevant. I would also submit, for those of you who've tuned in outside Texas, thank you. We always cover national topics on Mondays in our live streams, but this will be relevant because your states are going to be facing something similar. So Vance, you and I have had a lot of conversations with legislators in Texas, and the way I would summarize those conversations and unprompted is that, to the person, legislators in Texas have told you and me and some of our colleagues, we don't need this money by and large. Maybe some of the road highway infrastructure money we could always use because all these disaffected Californians are moving here and adding to the traffic. And we're happy to have them if they vote right. But the point is that there are so many strings attached to so much of this funding that the legislators are not even sure that they can take it. And it's going to take months for the administrative state in DC to write the rules, that is, to draw the strings to the money. And so thankfully in Texas, the impulse is to put both hands up and say, just hold on a minute, we're not sure we want to take $1 yet. If I give you the magic wand, Vance, what do you do if you're the Texas legislature with this money?
Well, Kevin, you hit it on the nail on the head. I mean, they really are pondering what to do with this money. I mean, whether it be process or the overall amount, even if you went in and tried to fill in each one of the one-time expenditures throughout the budget, where do you find that amount of money? Where, you know what I mean? So it's a really interesting dilemma that they have here. Texas in particular, just to start there real quick, we could receive about $40 billion just to the state of Texas, which our biennial budget is $250 billion that we're currently discussing right now during our legislative session that only lasts for 140 days, ends at the end of May. We may not even get all the Treasury guidance back for this next round of relief until close to that time. So it's really interesting how all this is going to go out. Out of that 40 billion, you've got about $12 billion that would just go to education alone. Education, when we've already fully funded HB3 within our current budget, which is our big school finance reform bill that they did last session, along with providing some tax relief in there for property taxes. Then you got $4 billion for some infrastructure projects. You got $10 billion to local governments, as if local governments need more money across the state. We know places like Austin, which are oftentimes wastefully using their money. Then you have about $17 billion going to the state itself, $17 billion. So out of all this money coming to the state, it's just a massive amount of money. And I think given the strings attached that have been brought up by Rachel and by Jared, and the additional restraints that I think this will have on state government for having its sovereignty to be able to determine what it wants to do with tax relief in the future, how it wants to spend money on education, which could end us up back in court based on the equity sort of issues that are within this next plan, right? This American Rescue Plan Act. I mean, given all of those restraints, my number one sort of suggestion is to reject this money, to reject all of it, to say that this is too extraordinary. It's too much. We're already bankrupting the country with about $28 trillion in debt. And the interest in the debt was $350 billion just by itself last year. I think whether you're a progressive, libertarian, or conservative, you can find better ways to spend $350 billion. And look, we need to start to have conservative fiscal policy once again. We need to restrain the growth in government spending, and this is going to lead to even more spending over time. I mean, I know some of the work that I think Jared and Rachel and others have been doing on this shows that if some of these measures that are in this American Rescue Plan Act, which I want to put quotes around the rescue part, if they're made permanent, this would be double that amount, closer to $4 trillion compared to the $2 trillion. So this could be a permanent expansion of our safety net system, much like the LBJ times of the Great Society, which would be horrible for the country and for the state of Texas. And so I'm hopeful what we can do is to make sure that if we do take these monies, and I think that should be a big question, that we provide it transparently, that we make sure that it's only for one-time expenditures, and that it supports key programs. And I think that unemployment insurance should be on definitely one of those items that Jared mentioned earlier, because if not, this could be a huge expansion of government in Texas at a time when we have been passing conservative budgets here that have been less than population growth plus inflation, which is a good measure of the average taxpayer's ability to pay. And if we don't do that, we will see higher taxes, less spending and benefit cuts here in the great state of Texas. And my goal is, as you know, Kevin, is for one day for us to have the responsible American budget at the federal level to really start to restrain growth, so we can make sure that we're focused on what the founding fathers had put for us to make sure that we're preserving life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, thanks for your clarity. I'll add to that, Vance, something several members of the legislature told you and me. And again, unprompted, we're not going in there asking leading questions. We're asking, what can we do to help and advise with our expertise? And they said, look, this bill, the American Rescue Plan Act, is nothing more than Congress's attempt to buy off the states, especially Texas, because both from a policy and political point of view, there is a real plus if you're left of center to be able to do that. So states like Texas will need to stand strong with some political courage, as you've outlined. I had another question to ask y'all, but we're already getting a lot of audience questions, so we're going to start taking those now. And if you're in the audience, there's time for you to get your question in. Just go ahead and type it into the comment section of the media channel you're on. Rachel, I'm going to pitch the first of these questions to you. And this audience member says, since the law is passed, or actually, Jared, we'll go to you on this one, and then Rachel, you'll get the second one. So for Jared, since the law is passed, can the states control the spigot and direct it more to businesses to keep employees working rather than be on a lingering paid vacation courtesy of the federal government?
States have some authority in how they spend this money, but there are some real constraints on their ability right now. Because like I said, there's 4 buckets in which you can spend this money. And you may have trouble actually doing so, finding a reasonable way to do so. Unfortunately, it does not appear that you can put this into an unemployment compensation trust fund. You can probably pay out current UC benefits, and I would encourage states to look at that, but you probably can't put it in the fund. You probably can't put this in a rainy day fund. You can continue to provide the sort of assistance that you did earlier with the CARES Act funding, that $150 billion. So you could have small business assistance, you could have individual assistance, you can, there are some things that you can do that you have to evaluate as to whether they're good policy, but you would have that capacity to design those for yourself. To something Vance said, I do want to point out, there isn't a binary question on whether or not this controls your fiscal policy. And most of the things that a state like Texas could do with this money probably do not tie your hand on taxes. Texas doesn't have revenue losses of any significance. There's some, I think, but some states have really big ones. Texas has some because of the oil situation. But once you cover that, and in the 20 some states that have no revenue losses, once you cover that, most of the other expenditures outside of this, they're not the sort of things that could be deemed to be indirectly supporting a tax cut. And therefore, accepting the money for those purposes, like the CARES Act style funding or some of the infrastructure like building out rural broadband, that's not going to constrain your authority on taxes. So you got to decide if you want to and how you want to, but accepting it doesn't tie your hands. It's covering the revenue losses, which states will have to figure out that, and it's potentially paying things out of your general operating budget. And those monies could theoretically be required to be returned if you had an aggressive interpretation of this. So at very least, if you accept the money, you might want to put some aside. So if you spend a couple $100 million, that could be questionable, but it's already part of your budget. Maybe make sure you have that. So if you have to pay it back, you're at least in no worse situation than you would have been previously. But it's not a binary accept it or not, and have your fiscal policy entirely determined by that.
Okay, well, that's helpful. We'll keep that in mind as we continue to advise our legislator friends. Rachel, next question for you is not an easy one, but I'm sure you're up to the task. This audience member asks, how in the world can we ever pay off the national debt with spending like this?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Even before we spent nearly $6 trillion on the COVID pandemic, I was talking about this is unsustainable. We have to do something immediately. And, big picture, we need to get our entitlement programs under control. The reality is we saw $1 trillion deficits over the horizon for the foreseeable future prior to this. And this has just exacerbated the situation. And we absolutely need to treat this debt crisis as what it is so that we don't risk trading a COVID-19 pandemic for a fiscal crisis going forward. But it's going to take hard choices. There's no easy way to do it. And of course, the solutions that I would suggest are to get spending in line. That's really the problem. When you look at the trajectories, spending is going like this. Tax revenues have stayed stable. It's a spending problem. And we need to get our entitlement programs under control. And we need to get the federal budget under control. And a lot of that could be left back to the state and local governments, as it originally was granted to them to be in charge of those spending and tax situations.
Sure. So it's what I'm hearing you say is it's just like our monthly budgets. If as a family or an individual, we take a look at the last month and we spent more than we took in, the first order of business is not to accrue any more debt, right? Which is to attack the spending. That's what we have to do at the federal level and increasingly at the state level. So thank you for that clarity. Vance, I'm going to come to you next with a Texas specific question. It's a question that I really like because twice I've been down to the border and have seen, as President Trump would say, that big, beautiful wall. We know from our research that the wall, along with other border security measures, have been very effective. And we want them to be effective because as a state that relies on immigration, we want immigrants who want to come here legally to be able to do so quickly and transparently and be part of our communities and help America continue to be what it's always been, which is a beacon of opportunity and prosperity. That's not what we have right now. I'm just assuming that the person in the audience who wrote this very simple question would not mind that context. This audience friend says, can we use the funds coming to Texas to finish the wall on the Mexican border?
Well, I think that's something else that should be on the table. From conversations, it seems like to finish the rest of the wall could be around $5 billion. So maybe that should be at least something that's on the table. As you mentioned, we do need legal immigrants to come here, as we've been talking about right now, as we have some major even budget challenges to where we need more taxpayers over time as well. And along with the increases in productivity, economic growth that migration has also provided. And so we need that legal migration. And we also need to know who's coming in and out of the border. And so some of those key provisions that have been made during the Trump administration, I think will also be helpful for Texas to understand not only who's coming in and out, but also for our economy and economic growth over time. And so I think that should be something we should definitely look at. It looks to be around $5 billion, and then see what else we can do with the rest of it.
Excellent. So Jared, I'm going to go to you next with this additional question from the audience. Is there a difference between the money that blue states are getting versus red states? I know Rachel and you have touched on this a little bit, but anything to add there in terms of detail for this audience member?
The way that the aid is determined, there's two different formulas. For the state level, it's based on your unemployment levels. And at the local level, it's based for cities on the community development block grant characteristics and formula, and for counties based on population. So counties is as neutral as you can possibly get. It's just purely based on population. For states, it's going to be based on unemployment. And what you see is some of the steepest revenue losses are in states that have heavy reliance on the energy sector. That's the reason why Texas does have some losses compared to other states. And some states like North Dakota and Alaska are significantly worse, and those that rely heavily on tourism. So that's actually more red states than blue, although it's like red states like Florida, but also blue states like Hawaii. Those are the states that have the significant revenue losses. They're not always the states that have significant employment losses, especially in capital intensive industries like oil and gas. Employment may not be down nearly as much as the revenue losses. So employment's not a perfect measure of that, but the honest truth is there's no perfect measure. They could have chosen other measures that would have equal problems. The difference, I think, is more significant on the local level, where using a formula based on HUD assistance for housing doesn't seem entirely appropriate to revenue needs and does benefit probably denser populations more. So it's not purely blue states, but it benefits denser populations more. So large dense cities are getting probably a better deal than a lot of other areas. But it's arbitrary. It's just a strange way to do this. On the whole, I guess blue states get a little more, but it's more that certain regions of the country or certain parts of the country that have characteristics that may not be terribly reflective of their economic or fiscal needs are getting more money.
Yeah. So, well, thanks for that. Next question, Rachel, is for you. And this is from an audience member who says they're wondering if there's anything in the American Rescue Plan Act that will lead to student loan forgiveness. It's a very specific question.
Mm-hmm. I unfortunately do not know all about the loan forgiveness provisions. I know there is an expansion in there in the amount of loan forgiveness that's given out. And unfortunately, that's not a targeted provision because, as we know, higher income people are more likely to go to college and to accumulate that debt. And so that's really disproportionately just giving money back to the people who have the higher incomes and are most likely to not be in need of it.
Yeah, thank you. Vance and Rachel, as I said when we started, there's so many details in this bill, there would be no way that the three of you could cover all of them. Vance, you want to add anything to that? This is something that we talk about quite a bit here.
Yeah, I think just trying to think through some of the single provisions in there about the loan forgiveness. One issue that has been there for a while now is that the loan forgiveness program, that if you're working for government or you're working for a nonprofit, if you paid for 120 months, then you have your loans forgiven after that 10-year period. Well, there's been those payments have been suspended. Loan forgiveness payments loan payments have been suspended for a while, if I can speak right. And essentially what that has done is they've said, look, we're going to count these toward that loan forgiveness. So in that sense, each month that goes by where those payments are suspended or waived, I should say, that does increase the amount of forgiveness later on and the cost of that over time. So I don't know if there's any other specific provisions in there, but I do know, as Rachel mentioned, that this is something that would affect upper income people more than lower income people. And it would be something else that would lead to widening income inequality. And at the same time, not really boost economic growth. One of the ways that we really need to think about boosting economic growth here is where you have more job creation. And how do you do that? Well, you get more businesses open again. And so one of the things that Jared mentioned a minute ago, where blue states may be receiving just a little bit more money than red states, but the problem here is a lot of your blue states are not opening, are staying shut down for a lot longer, have more restrictions in place. And so that is going to bring about a larger need, right, in the sense of more government assistance if we're continuing to go down that route. Whereas you have places like Georgia, Texas, South Dakota, Florida, right, that have been opening up, they're going to have a lot more job creation and less need for additional federal or a desire, right, for federal funding to come down the pipe. And so I think whenever you look at federal funding, forgiveness or anything along those lines, I really think that should be off the table here because it doesn't deal with the COVID situation. Again, going back to what we've been discussing this entire time, only a small part of this American Rescue Plan Act was actually going to COVID relief, maybe 9%. And so this is something we really should be focused on in getting more economic growth and job creation in the process.
Yeah, thanks, Vance, for that response. So we have one more audience question that I'm going to turn into a lightning round, and then I'll ask the proverbial last question, which is about optimism. So the lightning round question, and Jared, we'll start with you. This audience member is asking, what are the the worst examples of this not being about COVID relief, I would start by saying perhaps the $600 million that was earmarked for the city of San Francisco to keep doing what it's doing, to unfortunately keep homeless people caught on drugs and alcohol, continuing to use drugs and alcohol. And I say that wanting homeless people not to be doing that. So I'll start that way. But Jared, what one or two things would you say are the worst provisions?
Well, I'm going to punt a little because I do state tax policy and we don't have positions on a lot of the other expenditures. I do think it's wasteful to put $350 billion towards state aid that's not targeted to any real purpose as opposed to meeting some of the immediate needs. I think that there's provisions targeted at individuals that are just even the $1,400 checks that are just very broad, very vague, aren't necessarily meeting needs. But I'm not going to get into the individual line items. It's just outside of our purview as an organization.
Sure. Well, I'm going to count your response as a very good one. So thank you. No punting at all. Rachel, what about you?
Yeah, I'll list two here. So one is a little known bailout for a select group of private union pensions. So there's a massive problem with these private union pensions across the US. They've accumulated $673 billion in unfunded promises. So this bill is going to kind of bail out the tip of the iceberg. It's providing $86 billion unconditional cash just given to a select group of these plans, about 13% of them. But the reality is 96% of the people who have one of these plans are in a plan that is less than 60% funded. And the bill does nothing to hold those unions and those employers accountable to make sure that they actually put the money aside to keep good on their promises going forward. So it actually exacerbates the situation. Second thing, I would talk about the unemployment insurance. Yes, unemployment insurance is targeted, but the way that the government has gone about it in this situation, creating a separate program that has almost no checks, they have widely opened the doors to fraud and abuse. And we've seen so many instances of this. In my own state of Maryland, half of the claims that have been made in 2021 have been determined to be fraudulent. And that's great that our state has caught those, but there is at least $63 billion. That is what the Inspector General said is the minimum amount that's already been fraudulent so far. And so we're just encouraging more of this by expanding the level and the amount of time that people can get them.
Yeah, those definitely rank among the worst. Thanks for offering them. Vance, what about you?
So one of the neat things last year, whenever I was working on the president's budget, was, well, I guess it was 2 years ago now, time flies. One of the chapters in there was we had on wasteful and unnecessary spending. And so my former boss, Russ Vogt, who was the director of OMB, that was something that was really hard on his mind, where he really wanted to attack. And so over the course of a 10-year span, we found $4.6 trillion in savings. Now, of course, the budget, the federal level, didn't really balance until 15 years later because there's so many problems with it. But a key part of this is looking for what wasteful and unnecessary spending, because you see this so many times, especially with these large programs and bills like this of our taxpayer dollars, mind you, of $2 trillion. And so just a couple of things here. $270 million for National Endowment of the Arts and the Humanities. I'm not sure what that has to do with COVID. There's $200 million for the Institute of Museum and Library Services. There's $91 million for outreach to student loan borrowers. There's $50 million for environmental justice grants. I mean, you can kind of go down the list of how this is a progressive wish list. And a big one that I'll throw out there, may get some bad emails for this later, but there's $129 billion that goes to K through 12 education. And I'm just not sure why K through 12 is getting more funding when many of them have been closed and haven't had their doors open and are doing virtual education and other things that don't necessarily meet the needs of each one of those children. And instead, we're doing these blanket sort of policies. And so why are schools getting additional funding when the first round of CARES Act provided a lot of funding for them to beef up safety issues and things at these schools? And so it seems like I'm just still questioning of why that would be the case. And last but certainly not least, Kevin, there is a lot of money in here that's going to expand Obamacare and the Obamacare subsidies, $45 billion for an expansion of the Obamacare services. And on top of that, you're getting money for Medicaid, to where a part of the CARES Act was this 6.2 percentage point bump in how much states could receive in Medicaid funding. And what it said was that no one could income out of their eligibility, right? So you couldn't get more income and then go off of Medicaid like you normally would, or even age out of Medicaid. And so what this has done is put many more people on Medicaid than the program was ever intended. Imagine that, government, right? And so what happens is it's not been a targeted program, and it's leading to larger and larger social safety nets that's going to be a burden on the budget and ultimately on our tax dollars and on our future. And so I just see so many areas in this budget that's just like, what is happening to our country? And we've really got to get back to fiscal sanity as quickly as possible. I mean, even during the Trump years, you had the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you had the deregulation, more job creation, tax revenues going up, but you still had Congress that was continuing to rapidly expand government spending. And we've got to get this government spending under control.
Hear, hear. Well, we could talk just about that for a lifetime, but of course, we're getting toward the end of our time together, and always like, if time allows, to ask our guests this question, and that is, after we've experienced what we've experienced with COVID itself, with shutdowns, with the election, with the storming of the Capitol, with civil society being fractured, and now with this monstrosity of a bill becoming law, why'd you wake up this morning optimistic about America? Rachel, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Kevin. I love ending on an upbeat note. And I just always go back to, I mean, America was founded on this desire for freedom and for opportunity. And we've been through many adversities, and we've come out stronger for them in the end. And, you know, when you wake up every morning, when I wake up and the sun is there, and knowing that there is no person and there is no policy that can take that away, I think that's a reason for optimism.
Thank you. Very well said. Jared?
You know, honestly, some of the things that I say are a problem in the bill are actually good news for the country. The fact that we have money that states aren't going to know how to spend is in large part because revenues are stable. Because even though we obviously have too high of unemployment compared to where we were, it's far better than even the most optimistic projections when we were looking at this 10 months ago. There have been some very good policies at the federal level, and also just, a lot of good decisions made by individuals and by states that have left us in far better shape than many of us probably expected. And I think we at the Tax Foundation have been pretty optimistic all along that there were going to be some positive economic elements here, that we're going to see a recovery faster than many feared. But we're in surprisingly good shape from a revenue point for the states, and also economically, the recovery is coming along pretty nicely. And hopefully, as we all get vaccinated, that will speed up even more. But it's good that we don't know how to spend some of this money. It's just unfortunate that it was appropriated.
Yeah, that's an excellent, albeit ironic point and observation to make. Thanks so much, Jared. Vance, Mr. Optimism, what say you?
Well, Kevin, you know me for a long time now, and I always have a smile on my face. You don't really see an economist who's optimistic very often, but I am one of them. And truthfully, this comes from, I believe it's God's will for us to be free and to prosper, that these are inalienable rights that we have, and that every day I can wake up knowing that, and seeing my boys, seeing my kids, and hopefully helping them to have a better future. And from the great work that you, Kevin, have doing, and Jared and Rachel and others at our great institutions that we have, is to try to continue to strengthen these types of institutions and this idea of this Republic of America that we have with the blessing to live here in what I believe is the greatest country ever. And so we continue to find ways to strengthen it, and to live in Texas of all places as well, like I do now. I don't have any reason to not be optimistic about the future, even given some of these challenges that we face. And we're continuing to face challenges, but that's what we do with the freedom that we have and the prosperity that we have, is to overcome them, given whatever those challenges are going to be. And so I'm going to continue to be optimistic and bet on the future, be long on Texas, be long on America, because, free market capitalism is the best path to prosperity.
Yeah, that too is well said. So to my colleague and good friend, Dr. Vance Ginn, to Jared Walczak, Rachel Greszler, thank you all so much for a wonderful conversation. Most importantly, for the work that the three of you are doing, and in your case, Jared and Rachel, for the work that your organizations, the Tax Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, do. You're very important public policy groups, but more importantly than that, as I would like to think the Texas Public Policy Foundation is, you're your organizations are institutions of civil society. And that's why I wake up optimistic. I wake up optimistic in spite of some public policy that Congress passes. I wake up optimistic in spite of some wrong-headed administrative state decisions, in large part because I know that the state legislatures, at least the majority of them, the governors, at least the majority of them, the attorneys general, at least the majority of them, will stand up for federalism and for common sense. And being a historian, I know that there have been many times in our country's history when about half of us have thought that the end of the American ideal is near. And every single time, as Rachel indicated, we've been up to the task. I do not think that this will be an exception to that. In fact, I think we have bright days ahead. But those begin by calling a spade and calling bad public policy, bad public policy. So hopefully, if you're in the audience, we've given you some tools to talk to your state legislators, to your statewide elected officials about. And if this comes up again in Congress in some form or another, to be calling your member of the U.S. House and your 2 members of the U.S. Senate. So thank you all so much for joining me today. Those of you in the audience, thanks for always carving out time for this. May God continue to prosper the work of your hands, and may He continue to bless this great country. Thank you.